A wall of sand and mud 5 feet high. That was the only thing standing between a very large, very shallow lake and the people who slept beside it. Hold on to that number, 5 feet. On the 6th of September, 1928, a storm gathered in the far eastern Atlantic, out near the Cape Verde Islands. It had an ocean to cross before anyone in America needed to care. By the time it was done, it had become the deadliest hurricane ever to strike the state of Florida. It announced itself in the Caribbean first. On the 12th of September, it tore across Guadeloupe. On the 13th, it hit Puerto Rico at the very top of the scale, the strongest a hurricane can get, and it did it on the feast day of St. Philip. So Puerto Ricans gave it a name of their own, San Felipe Segundo. 312 people died there. No storm hit that island harder until Maria in 2017. On the 16th, it crossed the Bahamas and killed 18 more, so Florida knew. That's the part people forget. The newspapers carried it, a monster in the islands, more than 1,000 dead. On the coast, people boarded up windows, filled the bathtub, and sat down to wait. They were watching the wrong thing. On the evening of the 16th of September, the hurricane came ashore near the Jupiter Lighthouse and drove west across Palm Beach County. Winds around 145 miles an hour. In West Palm Beach, it flattened 268 businesses and damaged 490 more. 1,711 houses gone, more than 6,300 others torn up. A 10-foot wall of seawater came over the coast, and that was the opening act. 40 miles inland sat Lake Okeechobee, the second largest freshwater lake entirely inside the United States, and shallow as a dinner plate. Around its southern rim, farmers had piled up that low ridge of sand and muck, 4 to 5 feet. Behind it lay the black soil farms of the Everglades and the towns that worked them. Bean City, Belle Glade, Chosin, Pahokee, South Bay. Thousands of the people living there were seasonal laborers, African-American families, workers from the Bahamas and the Caribbean, housed in shacks and camp barracks right at the water's edge. Now think about what a hurricane does to a shallow lake. The winds came out of the north and northwest and shoved that entire lake south. 6 to 9 feet of water stacked against a levee built to stop 4 or 5. Do the math. The dike failed in the dark, and the lake walked out over the farmland. Then the storm swung past to the northwest, the wind reversed out of the south, and the water rolled straight back over the northern shore. More than 1,200 square miles went under. People climbed onto roofs that came apart under their hands. They held onto floating wreckage in water crawling with snakes driven out of the sawgrass. Entire families were carried miles into the Everglades and never seen again. At least 2,500 people died in Florida. Some historians say closer to 3,000. And for decades, the official number sat far lower because nobody could say how many migrant workers had been out in those fields that week. Nobody had counted them when they were alive. What came next is the part that should sting. More than 1,500 bodies went into a mass grave at Port Mayaca. Many more were burned on pyres in the fields. Others were trucked to West Palm Beach, and there the sorting began. 69 bodies, 61 of them white, were laid in a marked grave at Woodlawn Cemetery. 674 African-American dead were put in a mass grave in the city's Paupers Field, at Tamarind Avenue and 25th Street. Segregation followed people into the ground. That grave went unmarked, and in the 1950s, the city paved a street across part of it, turning up bodies as they worked. Governor John Martin counted 15,000 families with nowhere to live. Damage, at least $25 million in 1928 money. Then the reckoning started. Florida's legislature created the Okeechobee Flood Control District and told it to work with the Army Corps of Engineers. In February of 1929, President Herbert Hoover came down and walked the wrecked lakeshore himself, and that visit moved Washington. On the 3rd of July, 1930, Congress passed the Rivers and Harbors Act, nearly 68 miles of levee along the south shore, almost 16 along the north. The Corps built it between 1932 and 1938, 30 to 34 feet high. Building codes across the state got teeth. After the hurricanes of 1947 brought the water back, Congress passed the Flood Control Act of 1948, and the enlarged system was finished in the late 1960s. They named it the Herbert Hoover Dike. 143 miles of earth wrapped all the way around the lake. The wall went up fast. The memory took 60 years. That grave on Tamarind Avenue stayed forgotten until 1991, when someone finally held a service over it. A marker followed. On the 12th of September, 2002, the site was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a memorial park now. Zora Neale Hurston put this storm at the heart of her novel in 1937, and for a lot of Americans, that's the only place they've ever met it. Drive the Lake Road today, and you'll see the dike, a plain green embankment running flat to the horizon. Nothing to look at. It's a gravestone the size of a county. On the morning of the 12th of March, 1928, a man walked up to a 200-foot concrete dam, looked at a leak running brown with mud, and said it was fine. 13 hours later, 431 people were dead. That leak was the dam telling him. He just didn't speak the language. Los Angeles was built on borrowed water. In 1913, a self-taught engineer named William Mulholland finished an aqueduct running more than 200 miles from the Owens Valley to the city, and it made him a hero. The man who turned a desert town into a metropolis. But the city kept growing. It needed a reservoir close by, something that could hold a year's supply if the aqueduct was ever cut. So between 1924 and 1926, the Los Angeles Bureau of Water Works and Supply put a curved concrete dam in San Francisco Canyon, about 40 miles northwest of downtown, 205 feet tall. Designed and built by one department, under one man's supervision. Hold that thought. One man. There were cracks and leaks from the beginning, in the dam and in the canyon walls holding it up. Mulholland looked at them and called them normal. On the 7th of March, 1928, the reservoir filled to the very top for the first time. He inspected it and pronounced it safe. 5 days later, the canyon disagreed. That morning, the 12th, dam keeper Tony Harnischfeger found a new leak, and this one ran muddy. Understand what that means. Clear water leaking is water. Muddy water leaking is the foundation walking out the door. He called Mulholland to come see it. Mulholland came with his chief assistant. They walked the site. The assistant declared there was no danger. At 3 minutes to midnight, the dam gave way. More than 12 billion gallons went down that canyon. The first wave stood roughly 140 feet high, taller than a 10-story building, moving in the dark, in country where nobody had a phone. Harnischfeger lived a quarter mile below the dam. He, his girlfriend, and his 6-year-old son were almost certainly the first to die. The bodies of the father and the boy were never found. A mile and a half downstream stood Powerhouse Number 2. 64 people there, workers and their families, asleep in cottages beside the plant, were killed. The concrete building was torn clean off its footings, and the water was just getting started. It swept the Edison substation at Saugus. It hit Castaic Junction, still 75 feet high, and took the bridge over the Santa Clara River with it. Then, just past the Ventura County line, it reached a railroad siding called Kemp. 150 Edison men were asleep there in a tent camp, building a transmission line. The night watchman, Ed Locke, heard something coming and ran through the camp, waking men as he went. He never made it out. 84 men in that camp died. Here's the detail that stays with you. The ones who'd buttoned their tent flaps shut tended to float and live. The ones who'd left them open drowned in their beds. That was the whole difference between a man going home and a man going into a mass grave. A canvas flap. But downstream, people started fighting back with telephones and headlights. In Santa Paula, a night operator named Louise Gipe took a warning call at 1:30 in the morning and began ringing houses, one by one. A motorcycle officer rode through the dark streets sounding the alarm block by block. Hundreds of people made it to high ground because 2 people refused to go back to sleep. The flood reached Fillmore at 2:20. It covered 54 miles from the dam to the ocean in about 5.5 hours and hit the sea around 5:30 on the morning of the 13th of March. 431 dead. Many never recovered. Among them, scores of Mexican migrant workers picking fruit in the valley. Men and women nobody had counted while they were alive. Bodies washed ashore as far south as San Diego. It took months to dig the dead out of the mud and the debris piles. The last remains turned up in August, a man, a woman, and a child, found by a ranch crew in the ashes of a fire they'd built to burn flood trash off their land. Then came the reckoning, and Mulholland didn't dodge it. At the coroner's inquest, he told the jury that if there was an error in human judgment, he was the human, and he wouldn't fasten it on anyone else. He also said, under oath, that he envied the dead. The jury declined to recommend prosecution, but it ruled that the building of a municipal dam should never be left to the judgment of one man, however eminent. Mulholland walked away from public life and died in 1935. And this is why the name still matters. Los Angeles paid out more than $7 million to victims' families and landowners. On the 14th of August, 1929, a state law took effect putting every non-federal dam in California under state supervision. Old dams examined and repaired, new plans approved, construction and operation watched. That same year, California required dams to be built under a licensed engineer. The agency born from that law is now the Division of Safety of Dams, and its people still review every plan and inspect every structure. Even the world took notice. In the summer of 1928, with the wreckage still wet, delegates from 6 countries founded the International Commission on Large Dams. The surviving center section, the piece the newspapers called the tombstone, was dynamited. Convenient. The story faded with it. For decades, this stayed the second greatest loss of life in California history, behind only the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and almost nobody outside that valley knew. That changed on the 12th of March, 2019, 91 years to the day, when Congress designated a national memorial and monument at the site. Go stand in San Francisco Canyon today, and there's nothing to see. Broken concrete in the brush, a quiet road. But every dam inspection in California is a receipt from that night, signed by 431 people who never knew they'd paid for it. There is a sound every coal town understands without being told. It's the whistle. Not the shift whistle, the other one. And when it went off over Mather, Pennsylvania, at 4:07 one rainy Saturday afternoon, women came out of their houses and started walking toward the shaft, and their children came behind them, and they stood in the rain and waited to find out which of them still had a husband. Let's go back an hour. Mather sat in Greene County, and it was a company town in the fullest sense. Pickens Mather and Company built the houses for the men who worked the mine. 3 shafts, each one 350 feet deep, driving into the seam underneath. The 19th of May, 1928, rain outside, which meant nothing at all, because the mine ran regardless. 462 men on the day shift, 151 on the night. Late that afternoon, the shifts were changing, some men riding out, some riding in, and about 279 were underground, and 2 miles from the main shaft, something had already gone wrong. In the northwest section, the airflow had been interrupted. Methane was gathering. Nobody knew. That's the part that should sit with you. You can't see methane, you can't smell it, and in 1928, the only warning most men had was a flame safety lamp and the judgment of whoever was in charge that day. At 4:07, the gas found an electric arc at a storage battery locomotive. It ignited. And then the coal dust, lying on the floors, on the timbers, on everything, the way it always did, took that fire and ran with it. Flame traveled roughly 8,500 feet along the haulage roads. Think about that. 1.5 miles of burning air, moving faster than a man can even decide to run. Up top, the whistle blew. 209 men were in the section where the gas lit. 193 of them died, killed by the blast itself, or suffocated by the afterdamp, the poisoned air an explosion leaves behind once the fire has eaten the oxygen. 2 more died later in hospitals. 14 got out. That's the arithmetic. There was a man down there worth knowing about. An assistant foreman named Callahan got his crew behind a Brattis, about 500 feet from the flame, and within minutes of the blast, he had a telephone to the surface. Rescue crews from the Bureau of Mines came up from Pittsburgh. Volunteer miners came from Greene, Fayette, and Washington counties, and from as far as West Virginia. Men who knew exactly what they were walking into went in anyway. Then, on the night of the 20th of May, word came up the shaft. Callahan and his men had been brought to the surface, dead. That was the night the town stopped hoping. The recreation building, the place where people had danced, became the morgue. Students from Waynesburg College came in to help handle the bodies. The Red Cross and the company's store were handing out food and clothing to families who had just lost the only paycheck they had. The last living man came out at 3 in the morning on Sunday the 20th. The last body didn't reach the surface until the following Thursday, and some of the men who got out went back down. C.A. Benjamin escaped the exploded galleries, turned around, and went back in with a rescue crew to look for his buddies. He was only alive to do it because another trapped miner, Cornelius Beatty, had dragged him along when Benjamin was ready to lie down in the black damp and quit. Beatty didn't let him. 195 men died. 7th worst mining disaster in American history, 2nd worst in Pennsylvania, behind only the Dar mine explosion of 1907. The county coroner, John W. Ross, reported that all but 3 bodies were recovered, and only 2 were buried unidentified. One small town lost roughly a quarter of its fathers and sons in about 90 seconds. So what did the widows get? And what did the country actually do about it? Pickens Mather moved payday up a week and pushed insurance settlements of $4,000 a death through in 10 days. Under a workman's compensation amendment Pennsylvania had passed the year before, in 1927, widows got between $10 and $15 a week for 300 weeks, depending on how many children they had. Orphans got $7.50 a week. Within months, the mine reopened. Miners from across the region filled every shift, and every survivor but one went back underground. They had to. It was the only work there was. Here's what changed for good. The state commission that investigated the explosion made recommendations, and those recommendations became law. Compulsory rock dusting of the gaseous and dry bituminous mines of the Commonwealth. Meaning you spread pulverized stone through the workings so coal dust can't catch and carry a flame the way it carried one through 8,000 feet of Mather. Rock dusting was extended to every part of a mine. Regular inspection of electrical equipment followed. Wetting down the coal followed. That's underground. But who was allowed to walk in and check? Pennsylvania had been inspecting mines since the 1870s. The federal government had no authority to inspect an American coal mine at all. None. Until the Federal Coal Mine Inspection Act of 1941, followed by the Federal Coal Mine Safety Act of 1952. 13 years after Mather, a federal inspector could finally open that door. The Mather mine kept working until 1964. In 2002, a memorial went up near the park in the center of town, and the Union president who spoke there called those men heroes. Men who produced something every single American used and died producing it. The whistle that blew that afternoon still exists, by the way. A retired miner keeps it at his house. Every rock-dusted rib in a Pennsylvania mine is a receipt. Signed at 4 on a rainy Saturday. "13 children boarded a ship in New Jersey on a Saturday. Not one of them was alive by Monday afternoon. And the thing that killed them wasn't the storm. It was a radio that stayed silent for a full day while a captain hoped the problem would fix itself." The Vestris was a British steamer, built in 1912, working the run between New York and the River Plate for the Lamport and Holt line. On the 10th of November 1928, she sailed from Hoboken, New Jersey, bound for Barbados in South America. 128 passengers, 198 crew. She should never have left the pier in the state she was in. Her ballast tanks hadn't been pumped out. The hatches over her coal bunkers were buried under coal and hadn't been battened and secured. She was loaded below her load line, riding too deep, carrying more than she was legally allowed to carry, and a coal port about 4 feet above the waterline was sitting partly open. 4 feet. Remember that number. The next day, the 11th of November, she ran into a heavy gale and started leaning to starboard. The list got worse as the cargo shifted, then worse again as the coal in the bunkers slid after it. Water was coming in. Captain William Carey tried to pump out the ballast tanks that controlled the ship's balance, and it didn't work. The angle got so steep that passengers couldn't move properly in their own cabins, and the ones who made it topside found the deck already awash. So here's the decision that killed people. The ship started leaking on the 11th of November, and no distress call went out that day. None. The first SOS wasn't sent until 56 minutes past 9 the next morning, and the position it gave was wrong by about 37 miles. It went out again at 4 minutes past 11. Sometime between 11 and noon, off Norfolk, Virginia, the order finally came to man the lifeboats. By then, the ship was lying over too far to launch them properly. Watch what that means. Most of the women and children were put into boats number 2, 4, and 6 on the port side. The boats hung up on the plates and wouldn't slide down the tilted hull. A fall gave way, and the bow of number 4 dropped, spilling mothers and babies straight into the water. A davit arm broke and came down into number 2 while she hung against the ship's side, crushing skulls and arms, smashing through her bottom. The crew worked 2 hours trying to cut number 6 free of her cables. They never managed it. When the Vestris went under, boat 6 was still attached to her, and it went down with the ship. That was the whole plan for saving the women and children. 3 boats. All 3 failed. The Vestris sank at about 2 in the afternoon on the 12th of November, roughly 200 miles off the Virginia coast. Now the other side of the ledger, because there was one. In the water and in the boats was a 23-year-old sailor from Barbados named Lionel Licorice. He spent 14 hours keeping a lifeboat afloat in a gale and swimming through shark-filled water after survivors. He had no oars, so he went over the side and got some. Then he worked the wreckage and pulled out about 20 people. 20. Rescue ships reached the scene late on the evening of the 12th and through the early hours of the 13th. The American shipper, the French tanker Miriam, the German liner Berlin, and the battleship Wyoming, joined by Navy destroyers and Coast Guard cutters. Survivors were landed at Norfolk on the 13th. Rescue work ran until midday Tuesday. A stewardess and a passenger were among the last picked up. They'd kept each other awake in the water by trading jokes. At least 111 people died. Not one of the 13 children survived. Of 33 women, 8. Captain Carey went down with his ship. 22 bodies were recovered. The inquiries turned into a national scandal, and they should have. A steamship inspector told the New York Times the officers hadn't measured up to what anyone would expect on a British ship. A judge concluded that if Carey had sent a distress signal when the trouble began, the evacuation would have been organized, and everyone aboard might have lived. Everyone. Investigators tore into the lifeboat handling and the outdated life preservers. Bookings across the line collapsed, and Lamport and Holt's South American service was finished by 1929. Then came the part that outlived everybody involved. Rescue crews testified they'd pulled bodies out of the sea floating face down, people wearing cork life jackets that held them up, just not the right way up. Think about that for a second. The safety equipment worked, and they drowned anyway. On that evidence, the American Merchant Marine authorized Kapok life preservers, which keep an unconscious person's face and head clear of the water. Other seafaring nations followed. And this wreck pushed the world's shipping powers into a room together. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was convened in London the following year, signed on the 31st of May, 1929, and came into force in 1933, carrying forward the protections of the earlier Titanic-era convention, plus fire safety measures like fireproof bulkheads, whose necessity the Vestris had just demonstrated. The load line question got its own treaty, signed in London on the 5th of July, 1930. Those safety drills on modern passenger ships? They trace straight back through this wreck. One more thing came out of that November. The Associated Press sent a reporter named Lorena Hickok to cover it, and her account became the first story to run in the New York Times under a woman's byline. The Vestris lies about 1.25 miles down, somewhere off Virginia. Nobody has ever brought her up. Every muster drill you've ever stood through on a ship, bored, holding an orange vest, half listening, is the argument she lost. 20 people died in Lynn, Massachusetts, on a Thursday morning in 1928. The company responsible was fined $100. That's the whole story, and I want you to hold on to that arithmetic, because everything I'm about to tell you happened between those two numbers. Start with the building. In 1921, a factory went up at 93 Brookline Street, built before the zoning laws, which meant nothing stopped anyone from dropping it right into the middle of a thickly settled residential neighborhood. Concrete, reinforced steel, a cement floor. Everybody assumed it was fireproof. The nearest house stood 12 feet away. The Preble Box Tow Company had been around about 30 years, first as the Preble Thomas Company, reorganized around 1924 under the new name. 50 employees, give or take. A box tow is the stiff reinforcement inside the front of a shoe. Lynn was a shoe town. This was shoe work. Nothing about it looked dangerous from the sidewalk. Now look at what was actually inside. Pyroxylin, acetic ether, gun cotton, naphtha, alcohol. Pyroxylin gets made by treating dry gun cotton with acetic ether, and they used it to produce imitation leather. Gun cotton in a shoe factory 12 feet from a family's kitchen. A grand jury would later find 4 to 5 tons of celluloid and flammable liquid sitting on that property. 4 to 5 tons. At about 20 minutes to 8 on the morning of the 8th of November 1928, the building let go. A series of explosions, one after another. Flames shot out of the roof and out of all 4 sides at once. The cement bricks that made up the walls were thrown clear over Groveland Street. 5 houses behind the factory caught fire. 2 workmen were blown through a cement wall a foot thick. Through it, another went out a door and landed in the street 20 feet away. And this was a workday morning. People walking to work, kids heading to school. 50 of them, neighbors and passers-by, were cut open by flying glass. You want to know who called it in? A 12-year-old boy. He couldn't reach the fire alarm box, so a friend boosted him up to it. Apparatus came from Swampscott, Marblehead, and Saugus to back up the Lynn Fire Department, while crews from Peabody and Revere moved in to cover the emptied Lynn stations. A man named John Kelly, who owned the laundry across the street, handed his shop over to the Red Cross for an aid station. Now that house 12 feet away, 44 Groveland Street, belonged to the Blaney family, and it caught fire almost immediately. Lillian Blaney and 4 of her children died as the walls came down on them. The eldest daughter, Vivian, died in the hospital later that same day. 2 of the Blaney children got out badly burned. 2 others simply weren't home that morning. That's the only reason they lived. On the 11th of November, Lillian Blaney and 5 of her children were buried together at Waterside Cemetery in Marblehead. More than 500 people came. President Calvin Coolidge sent a letter of condolence to the eldest surviving son, Harry Blaney Jr. The mayor of Lynn, Ralph Bauer, started a public fund for the surviving kids. Then, on the 21st of November, the father, Harry Blaney, died of his injuries. 7th member of one family. 11 people died in the blast itself. 9 more died of their injuries afterward. 20. It is still the deadliest explosion ever to happen in Greater Boston, so the investigators show up. Watch what they find. The state fire marshal reported that vapors coming off the liquids in the factory had caught fire and exploded. Fire Chief Edward Chase went through the ruins and found an ashtray, cigarette butts, ash, in a building where smoking was forbidden. Then the state chemist, Pearlie Charter, said the sentence somebody should have said years earlier. Even the finished product had been known to explode, he testified, and a factory using materials like that should never have been permitted within 500 feet of a home. 500 feet. The nearest home was 12. An inquest went before Judge Ralph Reeve. His report found the company hadn't grasped the dangerous conditions inside its own factory, and that its unlawful acts and negligence contributed to the deaths of every single victim. Reeve also criticized Chief Chase, said he hadn't properly understood his duties on fire prevention, though he stopped short of blaming him for the deaths. In January of 1929, Chase went public and said he was being made a scapegoat. Here's where it lands. A grand jury indicted the Preble Box Tow Company on 2 counts, using the lot without a license and storing flammable fluid without a license. In June of 1929, the company was fined a total of $100. And before you get angry at the judge, that was the maximum the law allowed. The same grand jury recommended changes to the Lynn Fire Department and named the captain in charge of fire inspection, John Day, who had walked through that factory 3 times and never understood what those chemicals could do. Then, on the 25th of September 1929, the chairman of the State Industrial Accident Board denied the double indemnity claims filed by the dependents of the dead and injured. Not enough evidence, he ruled, that the company was guilty of serious and willful misconduct. 20 people, $100. Here's the part that should stay with you. The licensing rules that company ignored already existed. So did the inspectors. Lynn didn't prove America needed rules. It proved that a permit system nobody enforces is just paperwork with a signature on it. Every regulation about how far a chemical plant has to sit from somebody's front porch was written by people who measured that distance the hard way. 12 feet. They knew the switch was broken. They looked right at it, decided not to lock it down, and sent 1,800 people over it at rush hour. And the man standing at the lever that afternoon wasn't a signalman at all. But we'll get to him, because that part gets worse. 5:05 in the afternoon, Times Square Station, the most crowded 4 minutes of the New York day. On the 24th of August, 1928, a 10-car downtown express sat at the platform on the Broadway 7th Avenue line, packed with roughly 1,800 people. It was being held there. Repairs were going on down the track. 85 feet south of that platform, a switch branched off toward a storage track. Track maintenance men had already found that switch was faulty, and they made a call. They didn't spike it, didn't drive it down and lock it immobile. They sent an empty train over it first as a test, and it went through fine, so they let the express go. At 5:09, the switch moved underneath a moving train. A United Press reporter named Morris DeHaven Tracy wrote it down for a city he said was still dazed. The 8th car split the switch, and before the passengers jammed inside could even cry out, it was skidding half sideways down the track. 100 feet on, it slammed into one of the great steel pillars that hold the street above out of the tunnel. It sheared that pillar clean off, tore loose from the 7 cars in front of it, and split itself in two, throwing passengers against stanchions, onto the track, under the wheels, into the tunnel wall. The 9th car hit the wall and the pillars on both sides and broke in half. The last car telescoped into whatever was left of it. The front section stayed hooked to the train and got dragged 100, maybe 200 feet before the 1st and 8th cars rolled over. Then the short circuit started a fire down there in the dark. One passenger said he heard a terrific grinding noise and then watched the car behind his rip straight through a steel pillar. 16 people were killed where they sat or stood, about 100 injured. 2 more died afterward, one the next day, one on the 26th. An actress named Jenny Lockridge saw the victims' bodies and died of a heart attack. Up on the street, the city moved fast. 10 blocks around Times Square were roped off in what felt like minutes, and a first aid station went up right on the sidewalk. About 50 doctors worked the station platform itself. 2 hours after the crash, the last of the dead and injured were out. Then 250 men went underground with picks, bars, and blowtorches to cut apart what used to be the 8th car and the steel stanchion it hit. 3 blocks of 7th Avenue closed so they could haul the wreckage up. Full service came back about 12 hours later. A stretch of 40th Street west of Broadway stayed shut. The crash had damaged what was holding it up. And one family got the cruelest hour of that week. A victim had been misidentified. The man walked into his own house 2 hours before his funeral was supposed to start. It's still the second deadliest accident in the history of the New York subway, behind only the Malbone Street wreck of 1918. Now, who did it? This is where the story goes sideways. Human error, everyone agreed. The exact cause was never nailed down. The maintenance foreman on the scene, William Baldwin, said somebody up in the signal tower south of 40th Street must have hit the button that threw the switch. The towerman, Harry King, swore nobody had. Baldwin got charged with negligent homicide over what was then 15 deaths and walked out on $10,000 bail. Then investigators took a closer look at Harry King. He wasn't a trained towerman. He was a clerk. And in early October, he admitted the rest of it. King wasn't even his name. He was Harry Stockdale from Baltimore, where he'd been convicted of stabbing a man with a butcher knife. The magistrate concluded Stockdale had defied Baldwin's order, moved the lever, hit the emergency button, and caused the wreck. Charges against Baldwin were dropped. Stockdale went to prison. Sit with that a second. 18 people died in the busiest station in America because a defective switch was left live, and the man at the lever was a clerk, working under a false name, with a record nobody had bothered to check. Mayor Jimmy Walker took the wreck, set it next to a fare increase the transit companies were pushing, and used both to go after the private operators in public. The city was already moving toward building and running its own subway. The municipal line opened in 1932, and by 1940, the whole system was under city control. But the operating fix was much simpler, and railroad men wrote it down plainly afterward. The moment you find a switch malfunctioning, you spike it closed. If it isn't spiked, you enforce a slow order over that spot. Trains crawl, or trains don't move at all. That's ordinary practice on every railroad in this country now. Find a bad switch? Kill it. then fix it. Nobody rolls 1,800 people over a maybe. The station is still down there. Millions of people a year stand on that platform waiting for a downtown express, checking their phones. And not 1 in 10,000 knows that 85 feet south of where they're standing, a rush hour once ended in a fire in the dark. 151 people took an oil refinery to the highest court in Massachusetts and said, "This thing is going to kill somebody." That was 1922. The court threw the case out. 6 years later, 14 men burned to death in that yard, and a jury ruled nobody had been negligent. Let me show you how that happens. Beacon Oil was founded in 1919 and started building its refinery in Everett, Massachusetts almost immediately. The plant sat between Beecham Street and the Mystic River. Its neighbors were wooden tenements, wood, next to a refinery. The company grew fast. By 1928, it was running Colonial Filling Stations, the biggest independent gas station chain in New England, and the Everett plant had spread across 100 acres, over the objections of the people who lived there, and those people had reason. Watch the pattern. April of 1922, an explosion at the refinery kills an employee named Harry Vokes, a retired vaudeville performer who'd taken a job at the plant. That November, 151 Everett residents file suit in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, asking the court to shut it down. Dismissed. The 10th of March, 1925, fire under 7 of Beacon's tanks drives 200 people out of their homes. The 10th of December, 1926, another explosion rattles buildings in Everett, Medford, and Winchester. One of those fires took 6 fire departments 10 hours to kill. 6 years of warnings.
Everybody in that neighborhood already knew.
3 o'clock in the afternoon, the 10th of February, 1928, 2 small oil stills exploded and threw metal fragments across the yard. Those fragments punched holes in the bigger stills. Oil poured out through the holes and caught fire. 10 stills went up. More than 500,000 gallons of oil burning at once. Flames went 200 feet into the air. Windows shattered across the neighborhood. Buildings shook within a 10-mile radius. And the column of black smoke? Visible from 56 miles away. A firefighting trade journal wrote down what witnesses saw in that yard, and it's hard to read. Men running with their clothes on fire, looking for help. Bodies thrown through the air. And with the injured screaming, crews could not get into the burning area for more than half an hour. Everything the region had came running. Beacon's own men grabbed the company apparatus while an automatic alarm went off. 5 minutes past 3, second alarm, Chelsea responds. 7 minutes past 3, third alarm, Revere. A phone call went to Boston, and Chief Daniel Sennett brought 2 of the city's engines up. Boston's Engine 1 arrived with foam apparatus, one of the first units on scene, followed by Engines 26 and 29. A crowd in the thousands gathered, and it took a large police detail to hold them back. Everett emptied its ambulance fleet. Then more came from Chelsea, Medford, Malden, the Metropolitan District Commission, and the Boston Police. Most of the burned went to Massachusetts General. Doctors and priests worked in the yard itself, on the wounded and the dying. In smoke thick enough to choke the rescue. 14 men killed, 36 injured. Within days, the state announced the money, roughly $100,000 in compensation insurance, the largest payout in Massachusetts history to that point for a single disaster. Under the Workmen's Compensation Law, a widow with dependent children got $6,400, a widow without children, $4,000. A survivor left totally disabled, up to $6,500. It went out the following week. Now here's the part that'll get your blood up. On the 14th of February, the state fire marshal, George Neal, delivered his finding. The cause was either a weakness in the tank or carelessness by a person or persons. That's it. That's as precise as it ever got. On the 13th of March, 1928, a month after they buried the men, residents went before the authorities and asked that the plant's permit be revoked outright. It wasn't. 2 civil suits reached juries, and both juries found the explosion had not been caused by any negligence on the part of the Beacon Oil Company. The refinery ran another 37 years. It closed in 1965, not for safety. Standard Oil of New Jersey decided it wasn't profitable. So did anything good come out of this at all? Yes, just not from a courtroom. Among the doctors treating the burned men at Massachusetts General that February was a young surgeon named Oliver Cope. Those patients were his first experience with burns. Cope became one of the most important figures in American burn medicine, the man running the burn response at that same hospital 14 years later, when the Coconut Grove nightclub fire filled every bed in Boston. The fluid resuscitation and wound care that grew out of that work is why a burn patient today walks out of a hospital that would have killed him in 1928. And the argument the neighbors lost got refought everywhere for the rest of the century. Everett's residents made it in 1922, again in 1925, again in 1926, and again in March of 1928. A refinery does not belong across the street from wooden tenements. Every buffer zone rule and hazardous facility siting law on the books in this country is that same argument, finally winning. 14 men, 6 years of warnings, and a court file that says nobody was negligent. 14 people died in Rockford, Illinois, and not one of them got a warning. Not because nobody saw it coming, because for 63 years it was against the rules for the United States government to say the word tornado out loud. I'll get to that. First, the afternoon itself. Rockford was a furniture town, factories along the river, 3 stories of brick and timber, hundreds of people inside, cutting and gluing and finishing chairs. On the afternoon of Friday, the 14th of September, 1928, every one of those buildings was full. That week, the Upper Plains and the Midwest were getting worked over by what is still the most intense September tornado outbreak in United States history. The day before, the 13th, the same system had thrown tornadoes across Nebraska, South Dakota, and Iowa. On the 14th, it reached northern Illinois. The tornado came down on the southwest side of the city, at Peoples Avenue and Kishwaukee Street, right on top of the Rockford Chair and Furniture Company. Destroyed the building. 8 workers killed. Then it lifted, snapping poles and trees, and came back down at 18th Avenue and 8th Street on the Mechanics Machine Company. 20 young women were working in that plant when the windows came in on them. Every one of them was cut. Every one of them lived. Farther along 18th Avenue, it took down the 3-story Union Furniture Company, then the Elko Tool Company, then the National Chair Company, then the houses around them, lifted straight off their foundations. It stayed on the ground for 26 miles, running from downtown Rockford northeast through Boone County and into rural McHenry County. And here's the thing that catches you. The path was only 100 to 200 yards wide. That narrow. Hundreds of structures destroyed. In today's money, about $20 million in damage. When historians went back in 1990 and rated the old storms, they classified this one F4, second highest category there is. 14 people killed, at least 100 injured, and these weren't numbers. Listen to who they were. 3 brothers, Everett Cornmusser, 16, Virgil, 17, Bernard, 14, were running ahead of the storm when the roof of a garage came through the air and hit them. 2 died instantly. Virgil made it to a hospital and died of his injuries. 3 sons out of one house in one afternoon. Tony Martinkus, 50 years old, was found dead in a chicken coop he'd been repairing. George Fagerberg, 51, and John Brunsky, 44, died in the wreckage of Chair Factory B. Swan Swenson, 40, and Axel Algren died in hospitals during the day, furniture workers caught under falling walls. Hundreds of people were left homeless. And because the plants themselves were flattened, families that still had a father lost his wages that same afternoon. Both at once. The city moved fast, to its credit. Committees from a half-dozen organizations went out and knocked on the doors of more than 160 families to work out exactly what each one needed. A man named Wilbur Adams was put in charge of storm relief and supplies. The Red Cross came in to assess the damage. The local paper collected funds. Men thrown out of work by the destruction got hired to rebuild it. And on Sunday the 16th, roughly 150,000 people drove into Rockford from all over the state, just to look at it. Now, the warning that never came, and why it never came. In 1887, General William Hazen of the Army Signal Corps ordered tornado forecasting stopped. His stated reasoning, and I want you to hear this, was that the harm done by such a prediction would eventually be greater than the harm from the tornado itself. The word tornado was forbidden in public forecasts. When the Weather Bureau took over national forecasting 3 years later, it kept the ban. So all through the 20s and 30s, the tornado death toll climbed, and there were no warnings, and nobody had time to take cover. That's why the people in those Rockford factories never saw it coming. Not ignorance, a rule. The ban on tornado warnings wasn't lifted until 1938, and even then, public tornado forecasts stayed prohibited. The break came from the military. On the 20th of March, 1948, a tornado crossed the runways at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma and destroyed 117 aircraft. The base commander told his weathermen it would never happen again without a forecast. 5 days later, Captain Robert Miller and Major Ernest Fawbush looked at the charts, saw the same pattern setting up, and issued the first tornado forecast in American history. That evening, a tornado hit the base again, about 100 yards from the first one's track. This time, nobody was killed. That success, among others, finally pushed the Weather Bureau to lift the ban on public tornado forecasts in July of 1950. In 1952, a severe local storms unit was created inside the Bureau, and it issued its first public tornado forecast on the 17th of March that year. Those forecasts became what we call tornado watches in 1965, the same year the tornado warning itself became a product. Everything after that was about speed, outdoor sirens, radio, television, NOAA weather radio, and now an alert straight to the phone in your pocket. 14 people died in a 100-yard wide strip of ground on a Friday afternoon in Illinois. Every siren you've ever heard, tested at noon on the 1st of the month, is there because for 63 years, the official position of your government was that you were better off not knowing. A crew of men were tearing down a dead mill in freezing weather. They had a little heater going so their hands would work. One spark came off it. 8 hours later, 5 city blocks of downtown Fall River, Massachusetts, did not exist anymore. Fall River was a textile city that had already started dying. The mills were closing. Money was leaving. And then came a bitter cold Thursday evening in February, 5:45, the 2nd of February, 1928. Fire broke out in Mill Number 2 of the Pocasset Manufacturing Company on Pocasset Street. Demolition workers had been in there taking apart the recently shuttered mill, and because it was freezing, they had a salamander heater running to stay warm. A spark came off that heater and landed on an oil-soaked floor in an empty building. That's it. That's the whole cause. Men trying not to freeze while they tore down something already dead. The flames went through the mill complex fast. Inside an hour, Fire Chief Jeremiah Sullivan had rung 3 alarms and called for outside help. By around 7 o'clock, apparatus was rolling in from the surrounding towns and from as far off as Boston and Lowell. Then the wind took the job over. A brisk southwest wind pushed the fire across Central Street. The wind shifted west, and the fire crossed North Main Street. It shifted again to the northwest, and the fire crossed Bedford Street. 3 shifts of wind, 3 brand new fronts, right through the heart of the business district. And the temperature that night hit a record low for the season. So the hoses froze. Sit with that for a second. Picture the men holding them, water turning to ice inside the line, ice on the ladders, ice stiffening their coats, standing in front of a fire that is jumping streets. At 2:30 in the morning on the 3rd of February, the fire was finally called under control. City Hall was damaged, but they'd saved it. Buildings were still burning in scattered pockets. It wasn't officially declared out until noon on Saturday, nearly 2 days after that spark. Police, National Guardsmen, and Naval Reservists moved in to lock down the burned district. 5 city blocks, completely gone. And the list of what burned reads like an inventory of a city's entire public life. 5 banks, 3 theaters, 3 hotels, 2 newspaper plants, 12 office buildings, a Jewish temple, 6 lunchrooms, the Central Police Station, the bus terminal, the telephone company building, the armory, restaurants, druggists, dressmakers, a barber, a bootblack, 2 deputy sheriff's offices, 1 lawyer's practice. The Fall River Historical Society lost its building and most of its collection. The Buffington building was supposed to be fireproof. It was engulfed anyway. Total damage, $20 million. A figure local businessmen argued about for years afterward. Now, the line you'll read everywhere is that nobody was killed and only a few people were seriously hurt. For that night, that's true, but it isn't the whole account. Arthur Lovenberry was 35, with 8 years on the Fall River Fire Department. He was driving Pumper 11 that night when he collapsed on Franklin Street. He'd caught pneumonia fighting the fire. He died 26 days later, on the 28th of February, 1928. 2 of his great-grandsons serve on that same department today, so the fire did kill someone. It just took a month to finish the job. And the timing was the real cruelty. Fall River had already lost mills. Now in one night, it lost the banks holding the city's savings, the newspapers printing its news, the hotels, the theaters, the offices where hundreds of people worked. A city on a downward slide got gutted, and the Great Depression showed up a year and a half later. They rebuilt anyway. Give them that. Within a few years, the banks in the commercial blocks were back up, including the Granite Block at the center of the district. Walk that stretch of North Main Street today, and most of what you're looking at dates from about 1928 or 1929, put up right after the fire, to newer standards, on the ashes of what burned. That stretch is now the downtown Fall River Historic District. Which brings us to the lesson, and it's an unglamorous one. Nothing exotic destroyed those 5 blocks. A portable heater, in an empty building, with nobody assigned to watch it. That exact hazard, open flame and heat carried into a vacant or torn-up structure by a work crew, is now one of the most tightly controlled things in American fire codes. A contractor needs a hot work permit before a flame or a torch goes into a building. A fire watch has to stay on site during the work and for a set stretch after the crew packs up. Temporary heating gear has clearance rules and supervision rules, and fire departments plan mutual aid in advance, instead of phoning Boston at 7 o'clock and hoping. Every one of those rules is there because cities kept learning the same thing, the same way. Fall River had burned before. A South Main Street fire in 1916 ran to $1 million. 1928 was worse than anything the city had ever seen. The corner of North Main and Bedford is still there, rebuilt. Ordinary storefronts on an ordinary street. Every one of them is standing on the night a spark from a stove took a city's downtown, while the water froze in the hoses. This storm never became a major hurricane. It peaked as a Category 1, 90 miles an hour, and by the time it reached the United States, it wasn't even a hurricane anymore. A nothing storm, a footnote. It killed at least 210 people, and the way it did that is a pattern that repeats every single year, so stay with me. It formed from a tropical wave near Tobago on the 7th of August, 1928, and rolled northwest through the southern Windward Islands. Tropical storm on the 8th, hurricane on the 9th, peak strength on the 10th, and early on the 9th it came ashore on the Tiburon Peninsula, that long southwestern arm of Haiti. Then it stopped, and it rained. For more than 20 hours, the town of Saint Louis du Sud was almost completely wiped off the map. 2 buildings kept their roofs. 2. In Grand Boucan and Petit Trou, roughly 80% of the buildings were flattened. Most municipalities in the path went under 8 to 20 feet of water. At least 200 people were killed in Haiti, 26 in Miraguan alone, and 12 in a single house in Belle Riviere. One house. More than 10,000 people were left with nowhere to live. In the worst areas, the flooding killed every farm animal and destroyed the entire coffee, cocoa, and sugar crop. Officials figured 3 to 6 months just to regrow what was gone. The unpaved trails that served as roads, destroyed outright. It was the worst storm Haiti had seen since 1886. And then came the second disaster, the slow one. About 100,000 people were facing starvation. Here's the part most Americans have never heard. Haiti in 1928 was under United States occupation, with an American High Commissioner posted in Port-au-Prince, and it was his office that later documented the recovery. Haitian President Louis Bourneau said it plainly. His government did not have the resources to handle this. He asked ordinary citizens to repair the roads themselves and to feed and shelter their neighbors. The government scraped together $200,000 for relief and set up 11 supply depots. The homeless were put into whatever large buildings were still standing. Within a few months, 299 homes had been rebuilt or repaired at a cost of just under $37,000, and those washed-out trails were eventually replaced with paved gravel roads 10 feet wide. In September, the American Red Cross sent $10,000 to the Haitian Red Cross, $10,000 for 100,000 hungry people. The storm crossed the Caribbean, dropped to a tropical storm on the 12th of August, and came ashore near Cienfuegos, Cuba. Total damage there? Some fallen banana trees. That's it. Then it slid into the Straits of Florida and started rebuilding itself. Early on the 13th, it hit Big Pine Key as a strong tropical storm, 70 miles an hour. Hurricane warnings went up across parts of the Keys that morning. The strongest wind anyone actually measured was 36 miles an hour. Along the Gulf Coast, people took shelter in churches and schools. A railroad station was destroyed at Boca Grande. In Sarasota, signs and trees and telephone poles came down. In St. Petersburg, streets closed for flooding and debris. One shut down because roof tiles were falling off a theater. And at one intersection, cars sat stranded in 3 feet of water. A Coast Guard vessel was getting hammered against the wharf. Meanwhile, Tampa and Pasagrille recorded their lowest tides in years, with almost all the water blown clean out of Boca Ciega Bay. On the 14th, it made a second Florida landfall near St. George Island at 50 miles an hour. Wind damage in Florida, minor. Barely a story, so everybody stopped paying attention, which is precisely when it started killing Americans. 10 days earlier, another hurricane had come ashore at Fort Pierce and soaked the entire southeast. The ground was already full. It had nowhere left to put water, and now this storm dumped more on top of it. 13.5 inches at Caesars Head, South Carolina. In Georgia, dams at Quitman were overtopped. A highway went completely under. 4 bridges were swept away, and a passenger train was abandoned on flooded track. The river at Macon crested at nearly 21 feet. Milledgeville lost its water supply. A bridge and 1,500 feet of railroad track went downstream. 200 families evacuated in Augusta. In South Carolina, Spartanburg braced for its worst flood since 1916. A tornado at Bath destroyed at least 50 homes, and 2 people died. In North Carolina, 4 rivers came over their banks and carried houses off. Asheville opened 2 shelters and laid out hundreds of cots. 6 killed there, 4 by flooding, 2 by a tornado. In Virginia, the Roanoke River crested 14 feet above flood stage, and 2 more died. 1 drowned, and 1 died of fright crossing that river. The system finally fell apart over West Virginia on the 17th of August. Total damage? At least $2 million. So what came out of it? The warning system of 1928 actually did its job on wind. The Keys got their hurricane warnings. What nobody could forecast was the thing that did the killing. Rain landing on ground a previous storm had already saturated, hundreds of miles inland, days after the storm stopped being interesting to anyone. That lesson took American meteorology decades to fully absorb. It's why the National Weather Service now issues inland flood watches and warnings that run long after landfall. Why river gauges drive forecasts of their own, and why forecasters explicitly track back-to-back systems hitting the same soaked ground. The deadliest part of a tropical system is almost never the wind. It's the water. 200 people in Haiti and 10 across 5 American states learned that in a single week in August, 1 month before the same season delivered a far more famous lesson at Lake Okeechobee.